Jack the Giant Slayer is the 2013 fantasy adventure film that follows the character of Jack, a young farmhand who must rescue a princess from a race of giants after accidentally opening a gateway to their land in the sky. It's a gritty retelling of the classic fairy tales Jack the Giant Killer and Jack and the Beanstalk. The film only grossed $197 million against a $200 million budget, which made it one of the biggest box office bombs of 2013. That, coupled with the poor reviews, meant the film was quickly forgotten by many moviegoers. It came with a wave of classic fairy tale retellings that we saw in the same era, releasing among other films like Alice in Wonderland, Red Riding Hood, and Snow White and the Huntsman. However, in my opinion, it is the best of these crop of films, and received way too much hate. So today, I want to take a look at Jack the Giant Slayer, to explore its history, analyze why it bombed, and offer some of my thoughts on why I think the film is underappreciated. The story of 2013's Jack the Giant Slayer actually starts back in 2005, before any other gritty fairy tale movies came out. The idea was proposed by screenwriter Darren Lemke, who described the story as a male-oriented story of a boy becoming a man, comparing Jack's journey to that of Luke Skywalker. In 2009, New Line Cinema hired DJ Caruso to direct the script, which had a rewrite done by Mark Baumbach. Later in the same year, Caruso left the project and was replaced by Bryan Singer. In 2010, Singer had longtime collaborator Christopher McQuarrie do another rewrite of the script. This new version expanded on the lore of the Giants and better fleshed them out. However, the changes also upped the budget significantly. Singer brought in Dan Studney to do a final rewrite of the script to help change the story slightly to get the budget back under control. Reportedly, Singer paid Studney $5,000 out of his own pocket for the rewrites. As for casting, there were many iconic actors that almost played the lead role of Jack. Jamie Campbell Bower was in consideration, however he couldn't audition due to a broken ankle he suffered while filming Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Aaron Taylor Johnson and Alex Pettyfer were also considered for the role, however it ended up in the hands of Nicholas Hoult. The rest of the cast was filled with the talents of Stanley Tucci, Ian McShane, Ewan McGregor, and Eleanor Tomlinson. So the script, crew, and cast was assembled and the release date of June 15th, 2012 was set. Principal photography kicked off in April of 2011. Shooting all over the good old country of Great Britain. The filmmakers took a page out of Robert Zemeckis and James Cameron's books by utilizing performance capture for the giant characters. During the production of the film, there was a bit of a back and forth between Singer and the studios behind the film. Singer had a more darker tone in mind, but the studio kept pushing for a lighter, family-friendly film so that they can market to a wider audience. Here's a quote from an LA Times article about the making of the film. To achieve something appropriate for kids 7 to 11 years old while not alienating teenagers, Singer toned down some of the sound effects, specifically a crunching sound when the giants devour the humans. It was about creating a tone like Raiders of the Lost Ark or Star Wars that allows you to get away with a lot of stuff because it feels like a movie, Singer said. It's clearly a movie, it's not Zero Dark 30. In January of 2012, the decision was made to push back the release date of the film by 9 months to March 22nd of 2013. It was then moved one more time to March 1st. This was done to give the filmmakers more time on the special effects, since there was a whole lot on this film. It also allowed the studio to attach trailers to The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. While pushing back the release date, the decision was also made to change the title from Jack the Giant Killer to Jack the Giant Slayer. The special effects were completed by 7 different visual effects houses, those being Digital Domain, Giant Studios, The Third Floor, MPC, Soho VFX, Rodeo FX, and Hatch Productions. Of course, all these special effects resulted in a huge budget, which is calculated around $185 to $200 million, and that's not including marketing and distribution. And given that a film needs to make back at least 2 to 3 times its budget in order to break even, Jack the Giant Slayer would need to crack $500 million in order to be called a success, and it fell short of a couple $100 million. In its opening weekend, it made $27 million, debuting at number 1 in the box office. Throughout its entire run in the US, it made $65 million, and overseas it made $132 million, for a total worldwide gross of $197 million. The Hollywood Reporter calculated the film's net loss between $125 to $140 million. The reviews were also pretty rough, as it is rated in the 50s across Metacritic, IMDb, and Rotten Tomatoes, with the consensus on Rotten Tomatoes stating that it's enthusiastically acted and reasonably fun, but Jack the Giant Slayer is also overwhelmed by digital effects and a bland impersonal story. Now that we are familiar with the history of the film, let's analyze why it bombed. First off, the title change and release date pushback was a bad omen of the film to come. You can tell New Line Cinema and Warner Brothers had a hard time on deciding how they wanted to market this film. Many people pointed towards a factor that had been a problem throughout the entire production, and that is the confused tone. Between the filmmakers wanting a darker, edgier tone, and the studios wanting a family-friendly adventure, it landed somewhere in the middle, which didn't make it too appealing to either group. Here's a quote from a Vulture article at the time. "And that middle ground of MPAA rating is a fatal no man's land. You're either in or you're out. But taking a PG-13 for a fairy tale, you're not in or out." A third senior production executive at a rival studio calls this, without irony, a giant miscalculation. For, as a fairy tale, the film had no natural adult audience, and the director choice guaranteed the elimination of any younger audience. It wasn't a kids' movie, and it certainly wasn't a film that an adult would have any interest in seeing. This confusing tone was really felt in the weak marketing for this film. While watching the trailers, many people were confused on if this was a kids' movie or not, and this led many people not bothering to check out the film in theaters. Not only that, but the posters for this film were pretty bad. Like, I'm surprised some of these went out to print. It also doesn't help that Oz the Great and Powerful came out 1 week after this film's release, which scooped up much of the intended audience that Jack the Giant Slayer was trying to score. Who knows if Jack the Giant Slayer would have been a hit with its original summer release date, but I think coming out in March did not do the film any favors. March is already a desert when it comes to big blockbuster movies, so putting it right next to another one meant it got overshadowed by the marketing power of Disney's next big thing. Another factor we need to consider is that the gritty fairy tale reimagining trend was already growing pretty stale. You can only put out so many mediocre films in a subgenre before audiences grow bored with the trend. For example, in 2010 and 2012, Alice in Wonderland and Snow White and the Huntsman dominated at the box office. But just 4 years later in 2016, both of their sequels flopped. Lastly, the film bombed because the budget was just too damn high. $200 million is pretty steep for a film that isn't connected to an already established IP, and it seemed like the studios behind Jack the Giant Slayer learned that the hard way. You know what? This movie gets clowned on way too much. It's actually pretty good. Not amazing in any right, but also not as bad as everyone makes it out to be. I'm not saying it's a fantasy masterpiece on par with The Lord of the Rings, but the more I've sat and thought about this film, the more I've come to enjoy and respect it. So in this section, I'm going to defend this decade-old box office bomb that I'm sure most people have forgotten. Because this is Isenhart Productions, and that's what we do. A big point of contention about this film is the special effects. A lot of criticisms I saw were pointed at the Giants specifically, saying that they were ugly and landed in the uncanny valley. While I do understand where these gripes come from, I think the giant designs work for this film. Giants are fantasy creatures, and at surface level they can just be described as big humans. However, I see them as vastly different from normal humans. They are supposed to look ugly and non-human because they are fairy tale monsters, and I like how this film heightened the grotesque characteristics. I know the whole "it looks bad on purpose" stance is a very stupid one, but I honestly believe it about some parts of this film. You could also poke a lot of holes in the whole plot device of the crown, saying it was lazy storytelling. I mean, a crown that allows you to control all the giants does seem very cheap and easy, but once again, I think it worked for this story. This is a gritty retelling of a classic fairy tale, and fairy tales are full of ridiculous magical items like this one. And the whole lore bit that was thrown in about it being made of the same material that giants' hearts were made out of is a great explanation of the power, and it is a very fantasy-based bit of world building. There are many characters in this movie that I like and I think were well written. For example, Ian McShane's King character was actually pretty well fleshed out for the amount of screen time that he was given. Although his character falls into the dead wife trope, you aren't being hit over the head with this fact like you so often see happen to characters with this cliche. One of my favorite scenes with this character, and probably in the whole movie, is when the giant falls to earth and the king makes the decision to cut down the beanstalk. In this scene, we basically see him accept the fact that he has to leave his daughter to die in order to save the kingdom, which says a lot to his morals since his daughter is basically all he has left of his family. There was just a lot more to this character than I was expecting out of this film. I also really liked Ewan McGregor's character, even though his haircut was stupid. Like seriously, why did they give him this haircut? His character isn't given too much to do, but he's still a great addition to the film and plays really well off the character of Jack. One thing this movie also does well is the exposition dumps. Exposition dumps are hard to avoid with fantasy movies like this one that need to establish a whole world to the audience. But I thought how they did it through the parents telling the kids a fairy tale was really clever. When this movie came out, it was also accused of cashing in on the reimagined fairy tale trend at the time, which in my opinion is not an entirely fair assessment since, as we discussed earlier, this movie was in development since 2005. I think I am giving this film so much praise because it reminds me of another era of Hollywood. These were the days when studios would dump hundreds of millions of dollars into untested fantasy IPs like this one. Sure, we do get some big budget fantasy projects nowadays, more commonly in the TV sphere, but they are almost always projects that are attached to a bigger property that has been proven to perform well. Fantasy is one of my favorite genres, and it feels like we don't get big budget fantasy movies like this one in Hollywood anymore, for better or for worse. I also appreciate this film because it knows what it is. It's a big, dumb action-adventure movie, and it's not pretending to be anything deeper than that. It delivers the action, it delivers the adventure, and it does it all while still being extremely entertaining. But as much as I defend this film, I do have to admit there are some weak spots. One of the big weak spots is unfortunately Stanley Tucci's character. His performance wasn't bad, as he is giving this role all he can and is chewing the scenery, but his character is just so one-dimensional. He's just a classic mustache-twirling villain that wants power, which works, but we don't understand anything beyond that, and he's as deep as a puddle. Not to mention he's killed before the final act, which I'm not sure I entirely liked. Also, his little sidekick was extremely annoying and I did not like him at all. The romance subplot of this film was also very underdeveloped. Isabel and Jack have like 3 scenes together where they actually talk, and then all of a sudden, they are in love. I think it's good that they didn't focus too much on this romance, but at the same time, for the amount of importance it has on these 2 characters' arcs, it should have been executed better. Additionally, even though I defended some of the special effects earlier, I have to admit that not all of them are solid. Some shots of the giants are pretty rough, and some bits with the beanstalk do look very cartoonish. But as a whole, I still like the special effects in this movie. Sue me. Lastly, there is a criticism that has come up several times already that I think is totally deserved, and that's the issue of the confused tone. You can really tell this movie was shot to be a lot more bloody than what the final product ended up being. There are tons of instances where people get eaten in this film, but the camera always cuts away before we see anything bad. It is obvious that the hard edge of the film was softened in post, which makes the end result feel a little lackluster. I would also like to comment that I am not surprised this film bombed. Like, come on, did you really expect this to make $500 million? I think that this movie is underrated, but not $500 million underrated, if you get what I'm saying. Jack the Giant Slayer is a blockbuster from a different time. A time when studios would dump stupid amounts of money into properties that weren't already attached to an established brand. And a time when we still saw fantasy on the big screen. It lost hundreds of millions of dollars due to a weak marketing campaign and has been pretty forgotten in the modern age. However, I still love this film, because it provides great action and fun fantasy elements. Although it certainly has its problems, I still think it's overhated, and deserves to be rewatched with fresh eyes. But what are your thoughts on Jack the Giant Slayer? Do you like it? Hate it? Or do you even remember it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This has been Tom from Isenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. See you next week.